Okay, hello everybody. We shall be making a start now. So thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar on grievances and top HR tips. So a warm welcome to you all. We always start by introducing ourselves. So for those of you who don't know who you're listening to, my name is Karen Falconer. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager for HR Solutions, and I shall be the lead presenter today. And I am joined by my colleague Atim Arden, and she is our Digital Marketing Executive. Now, she's here with me today just to field any technical problems. Hopefully, of course, there won't be any. But if you should experience anything, then please do use your control panel just to drop us a message and let us know in case it's something that's affecting everybody and it's something that we can try and sort out our end. Otherwise, of course, we will do what we can for you. But we are recording this session today. So if you were to miss any, then you can watch it again at another time. And you can also, of course, share it with your colleagues if you'd like to as well. We also make a copy of the slide deck available on request afterwards as well. So if that's something that's useful to you, then please do let us know. So you can also use your control panel. There's a section on there for chat and there's a section on there for questions. So as we go, if you've got any questions about the content today, then please do drop us a message. A team will be collating those and I will look to get back to you shortly after the webinar. All right, lovely. So that is us. That is who you're listening to today. And we're here then to talk about grievances. And this is how the webinar is going to be structured. And we do like to start off with some aims. I think it's good to start out by thinking about what you're trying to achieve. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll feel that we've had a bit of a refresh on what a grievance process looks like. That you will have been given an unfussy checklist of things that every manager, no matter what your level of experience of managing a team, can have to hand and get right when approaching grievances. And that we will have also considered in more detail some tips for improving approach and process as well. Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to begin just by having a little introduction to the topic of grievances. So you may probably be able to deduce yourself. A grievance then is a concern, a problem or a complaint that an employee has which they raise with their employer. Okay, so the issue could relate to their job, their working environment, or relationships with colleagues and even third parties as well. So we like to get you involved in our webinars sometimes. So I'm going to start with a question already and just ask you listening today about your experience really. So for those of you who have had grievances that you've had to deal with yourselves, you know, in your experience, what have grievances tended to relate to most out of those three things, which typically covers most grievances, I think. So do the grievances you have tend to relate to the job, you know, terms and conditions or how it works, the working environment, or relationships with others and how they're getting on with colleagues and things like that. So I am just going to launch a poll for you now. So you should be able to see now three options on the screen. So what do you think? Job, working environment, or relationships? I'm just going to launch that for you now, actually. There we go. So I'll give you a few moments to consider, and I'm not going to publish who said what or anything like that. It'll just give us a figure of generally how people have responded. So just give you a few moments. We've got most people voted already, so They're obviously still very much in the forefront of your minds. Okay, that's great. But most people voted. Just give you 5 more seconds if you want to have a vote. All right, I'll just close that off now and share the results. Okay, so you should now be able to see the results on your screen. So we've got about 13% of us have had grievances related to the job, the same working environment, and the vast majority to do with relationships with other people, so other colleagues or third parties as well, which I did think might be the case. It just seems to be that way, unfortunately, doesn't it? But yeah, okay, so we're probably pretty much all in the same boat there with the sorts of things that our grievances tend to be about. All right, so I'm just going to hide that off then now. And let's move on. So hopefully you'll agree those 3 areas tend to cover most grievances, and certainly they all pretty much seem to be about relationships with others. But anybody can, of course, come to have a grievance during the course of their working life. And employers should always address the matter appropriately and resolve it if possible. Okay, so of course it's not always possible to resolve a grievance, especially not always in a way the employee might like, unfortunately. So it's important that we at least do address the matter appropriately wherever we can. Now, good line management skills are pretty essential for this, okay, so for handling it correctly. And then, of course, for just minimizing the risk that those problems that have been raised get bigger or worsen, or even, you know, worst case scenario, result in a claim against the organisation. So now just going to do a bit of a quick look at an overview for a grievance process. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on this very long. So for those who are familiar, hopefully this rings true. And for anyone who's not done one before, this should give you a very concise overview of what it ought to look like. So, of course, it's got to start with an employee raising a concern. From there, you would generally try to address the issue informally in the first instance. Okay, so you'd start off with an informal approach to that concern, and you'd attempt to resolve it where possible. Okay, now the reason we do this, before I move on actually, the reason we do this is because the very nature of formalizing something can make it feel more clinical, you know, and sometimes more hostile even, or unfeeling. And I think especially where the issue relates to a relationship breakdown, then putting in place a formal approach can actually make it even more difficult to improve relations, or can make it take even longer. So if we can try and repair those relationships, you know, through an informal approach in the first instance, that tends to be more successful more quickly for most. Now that said, if the employee believes that actually it hasn't been resolved, you know, satisfactorily, or if you listen to what that person's got to say, or they tell you what the grievance is, and you think actually this is a really serious problem, then we would go to a formal approach. Okay, so we start off with an informal tack. If that doesn't resolve it satisfactorily for the employee, or if the issue is serious, then we move on to a formal approach. Okay, and this pretty much looks like this. Okay, so first off, the employee puts their concerns in writing. They are then invited in writing to attend a formal grievance hearing. Okay. And at that hearing, they are given the right to be accompanied. Okay, so they attend that meeting with the right to be accompanied. From there, we've had our meeting and we decide that if there are any further follow-up investigations to be had, okay, that they are conducted. The employee is then issued with a formal written outcome. And lastly, they are given the opportunity to appeal the outcome that is given to them. Okay, so that's a very quick look overview of a grievance process. And as I say, hopefully that rings true to most of you listening today. Okay, now I would just like to make a last point on that. So where it is advisable to try and resolve a grievance informally, okay, in the first instance, an employee should not be obstructed from raising a grievance, okay? So from raising a grievance formally, okay? So if they are saying to you, yes, I do think that they moved my lunch from the top shelf of the fridge to the bottom shelf of the fridge, but I want to raise it formally, okay, as a grievance. I think they're doing it on purpose to try and wind me up, okay? We might hear that and think, well, really? Are we going to go through this rigmarole for this? Okay, but you can try and say to them, look, let's just try and deal with it informally. Let's have a sit down chat. Let me just look into it, see if I can sort it out. If they insist, no, this has to be dealt with formally because enough's enough, you know, this is the last straw situation for me. There could be more going on than that, you know, so we shouldn't obstruct them from raising a grievance formally if they insist in the first instance. All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to key things to get right. And in this section, this is where I'm going to give you that unfussy checklist, okay? So it's just very concise list of points that anyone can have to hand, again, you know, regardless of experience level or skill level as a line manager, to help steer you on the right path for handling a grievance properly. Okay, so, and these are going to cover various aspects to do with a grievance. Firstly, keep a written record of cases, details, action taken, dates, outcomes, and so on and so forth. Okay, a written record or a paper trail is key. This is always vitally important to any employee relations process, you know, disciplinary hearing or, you know, redundancy consultations. Your paper trail is your evidence of what you did and why you did it, and proves that you did what you were supposed to do if you're ever challenged, okay? So keep a written record. Have a grievance policy, okay? And consider having a separate one for bullying, harassment, and whistleblowing, okay? Have a grievance policy. Ensure that that grievance policy details someone appropriate who an employee should go to if the subject of their grievance is their line manager. Okay, I'm going to talk about grievance policy in a little bit more detail later on. It is a very important thing to have, and it is important that someone is given the appropriate person to go to in a situation, and of course sometimes that is not going to be your line manager, so we have to detail someone else. Now, not necessarily going to be a person's name, you know, especially as that person might leave. You don't want to be updating your policy every time somebody leaves, you know, but a job title, you know, or an appropriate member of the senior management team, you know, for example. Next up is hold a meeting without unreasonable delay. Okay, now delays in a process, again, both grievances or disciplinary processes or other processes, you know, delays are a common pitfall area. We tend to prioritize other things that might be going on in the business, or people might be off sick or on annual leave, you know, many reasons why delays can come up. But we do need to give a grievance the due importance that it deserves. and try and keep delays to a minimum where possible. Okay, so we do need to make sure that we're building in time for it, and that we're being transparent about the reasons for any unavoidable delays, okay, just so that the employee is always being kept informed of the reasons why that's happening. So you might write to them in a letter to give them a note as to the reasons why, you know, unforeseen absence from the company or unavoidable annual leave, and so on. But just always try and keep delays to a minimum. In that meeting, allow the employee to explain their grievance, okay, and how they think that it should be resolved. This can feel like a bit of repetition for the employee, especially if they've, you know, put it in writing, but it is important that they explain it to you once again in that meeting. And again, this is something I will talk about a little bit later, as well as how they think it should be resolved, because you might come up with, you know, some fantastic ideas of how it should be resolved, and actually you might have gone far above and beyond, you know, what they really wanted you to do, or you might have missed the point, you know, without realizing, even with the best of intentions. So it is important that we ask them how they think it should be resolved. You might get a shirty sort of, well, isn't that your job to decide how it should be resolved, you know, but I think there's only very few circumstances where that would happen. And no, you know, we want to make sure we get a resolution that's going to be appropriate for you, and makes it a lot easier to do that if we know what you think would be appropriate. Okay, moving on then. Where you've had the meeting and you think that there is cause for some further investigation, if those investigations point to misconduct, okay, then this should be addressed under the normal disciplinary procedures. Okay, so quite often, you know, as we've identified, a grievance is going to relate to somebody else. Okay, and if that's about somebody else's behaviour, which might be inappropriate and not accepted by the organisation, then we need to handle that, and that would be entirely separate process. Okay, the grievance process is one thing. We step to one side and go through a disciplinary process to manage that employee's misconduct, okay, before then returning back to concluding the grievance process. On that point, sometimes an employee will raise a grievance and actually it highlights misconduct on their own part, you know, and you're thinking, well, you've had quite a part to play in this situation that's come up, and actually that behaviour wasn't acceptable to us, and you know, really we need to do something about it. That can and does happen, but again, any action you take against that individual should be separate to the grievance. Okay, a grievance is about an employee and it's their forum to raise a concern they have and get a resolution. It is not about giving an outcome or improving their conduct, okay, by giving an outcome letter in that grievance which reprimands them for their misconduct. No, the grievance outcome letter is about whether we uphold your grievance or not and the reasons why. If we need to reprimand them for their misconduct, that happens in a separate disciplinary process. Whether that results in a letter of concern or a formal written warning, that is the correct forum for any reprimand. Next up then, the written outcome. Okay, so we have had the hearing. If we needed to do any investigations, we've done that. If we needed to go formal in a disciplinary process and issue any warnings, we've done that. We're now coming back and wrapping up that grievance in a written outcome, okay? And that should be given without unreasonable delay. So I'm talking about delays again, okay? Because as I say, it is a common pitfall area. And quite often, there can be delays with giving an outcome because the investigations have taken us quite a while for whatever reason. But again, it's about transparency. Okay, so try to keep those delays to a minimum. And if you do think there are any unavoidable delays, let the employee know and give them an idea of when you expect them to be able to receive a written outcome. Okay, so we need to hold ourselves to account for the time the process is taken. Next up, ensure any appeal is held impartially and by a manager who has not previously been involved. Okay, so up to this point, you might be a person's line manager. They might have raised a grievance. Okay, they've submitted it to you in writing now. You've invited them to a meeting, fine. You've done any follow-up investigations, fine. You've then written the outcome letter to the grievance, fine. But if they appeal it, you may no longer be involved, okay? You need to pass it to somebody else, and I would say that that needs to be somebody of equal seniority or higher, okay, who has not been implicated in the grievance in any way, so that they can give an impartial view on the grounds for appeal. And lastly, always consider ensuring that the approach taken, okay, is consistent with previous grievances that have happened in the organisation, okay? So everyone can think, yep, that's how I was treated, yep, that's how they're treated too. Everyone perceives that they've been treated in a fair way and not differently to anybody else. So the approach is in line with any relevant policy that you have, okay? But it's also fair in the circumstances. Every situation is unique, okay? So even if we try to be consistent with how we've treated others, we're following a policy, various circumstances come up which make a situation unique. So we need to try and make sure that we are allowing for that and adapting the process where appropriate, okay? And lastly, we should also allow for any reasonable adjustments where someone may struggle to take part in any aspect due to disability. Okay, so reasonable adjustments is that legal phrase that we use when we're talking about amending something or adapting something or providing something, okay, that would enable someone with a disability to take part in much the same way that someone without a disability can. Okay. So that is that checklist. I'm now going to move on then to talk in a little bit more detail about 10 tips. So things that might add even greater quality to your approach for dealing with grievances and might even try to help to reduce them from coming up in the first place. Okay, so right, tip number 1 then. I'm going to start off with just heading off grievances, okay, because that's the ideal after all, isn't it? That we just don't get a grievance in the first place. Thank you very much. You might accept and agree, hopefully so. Niggles and frustrations and things like that are going to come up in the workplace all the time, for people. As soon as something changes or someone said something that's got lost in translation, all these sorts of little things can happen regularly in working life. But the vast majority of those things, never get as far as grievances, okay, because they can be resolved fairly easily, normally through a simple discussion. Okay, so as line managers, we need to be open to sitting down and having a chat about something. It's really not to be undervalued or overlooked as a technique. Building in methods that allow time for employees to give feedback in this way, regularly, is a really quick and simple way to prevent these small issues from manifesting, because it's always going to be the case that if people are internalizing things, that's going to build up pressure and compound an issue and turn something fairly small into a beast of a problem. Whereas even the perception of having an avenue, to let that out can greatly reduce, the stress, let's use that word, that the issue can cause. So, we can build in avenues like this by things such as regular team meetings, so perhaps if a couple of colleagues have got the same problem, they can say, well, let's save that and we'll bring it up that next team meeting. Great, or routine one-to-one catch-ups, for individuals who've perhaps got a more personal problem or don't feel comfortable speaking out in front of others. Employee surveys is another option, and so on. Okay, so building in avenues, it can minimize the impact of grievances full stop, even if they're not utilized. And if they are, a simple discussion might be able to put many things to bed. Number 2, ensure employees know how to raise a grievance and what to expect. Okay, so this point is all about managing expectations, okay, before you've even received a grievance. Manage their expectations to minimize upset and frustrations. Okay, now employers must have a procedure for dealing with grievances. So I said before that we'd come back to this. A policies can be boring for some. I like them, but that's the nature of my job. But a policy is a perfect way of letting employees know what to expect if they should raise a grievance. Okay, so they can digest that before they've even submitted it. And it also helps to ensure that they're all handled consistently, across the board, and reminds managers of all the key things that they need to get right. Okay, so if you don't have a policy, you really should get one. Okay, and I thought I'd add this in because sometimes it's not thought about so much, but did you know that a written statement of main terms, or a contract as we sometimes call it, or ingrain the two together, contract of employment then has to include, by law, details about how to raise a grievance, by law. Okay, so if you've had a professional write your contracts for you, I'm sure that it will contain a clause like this, but if not, if it's something you or someone else has tried to put together, please do check that your contracts state this, because it is a legal requirement, okay, that it says how to raise a grievance, hence why employers have got to really have a procedure there for dealing with grievances. Number 3 then. Number 3 is recognize a serious matter. Okay. Sometimes employees will have an issue at work that you become aware of, sometimes accidentally or sometimes because they've raised it with you, and it might be so serious, okay, that it has to be investigated, even if they do not wish to raise it as a grievance. Okay, so if somebody raises a serious matter, you need to tell them to put it in writing. Okay, this has got to be handled as a formal grievance, and if they say to you, no, I don't want to raise it as a formal grievance, I don't want to take it that far, okay, we must investigate it anyway. And this is because we have, the due duty of care ingrained within an employment relationship. we have to make sure that we meet that. So if somebody is telling you something which is deeply concerning, but they're saying they don't want to look into it, you have to advise them to raise it formally, and you have to advise them you'll be investigating it regardless. Okay, so when I'm talking about, a serious matter here, I'm talking about things like bullying, okay, harassment, sexual harassment, discrimination, severe matters that an organisation, or just anybody would not morally want to tolerate. So we need to make sure that our ears are tuned to listening to what somebody is saying to us, okay, and identifying whether or not that is a serious matter that it should be raised formally or investigated regardless. Number 4 then is follow the ACAScode. Okay, so not something we necessarily have on our bedside table, but the ACAScode of practice on discipline and grievance, okay, sets out the standard of reasonable behaviour required for certain situations. Okay, so if in doubt, or if you get a grievance raised, and especially if you've got a grievance raised where you think, this could go somewhere, like tribunal maybe, please have this code to hand. Now, the reason for that is because if somebody were to take you to an employment tribunal about their grievance, okay, and worst case scenario, they win, if you haven't followed the ACAScode, then the amount that they were awarded, okay, because of the grievance issue, can be uplifted by 25%, as much as 25%, because the ACAScode was not followed, okay? Now, on the flip side, but granted, it's still a bit negative, if an employee were to take to tribunal because of a grievance issue and won, but they hadn't followed the ACAScode, then an award can also be decreased by up to 25%, okay, for their failures to follow it. So, this is a code which is not just there to put hurdles in the way for employers, as some people see it, it is there as this standard of reasonable behaviour for employers and employees, okay? So we are all parties, expected to behave reasonably in trying to resolve a grievance matter, and so we should look to try and follow this ACAScode where possible. Now, if you were to look at your control panel, you'll see a section for handouts, and I've taken the trouble to upload a copy of the ACAScode of practice on grievances for you. So either now or you'll have some time at the end of the webinar, you can go on there and download that, and I would give it a read through, when you've got some spare time, or just at least make sure you've got it to hand if a grievance comes up, so you can make sure that you're following that as well. Okay, lovely. So, number 5 is get the grievance in writing. Okay, so the grievance should be submitted by the employee in writing. The ACAScode requires it, firstly, okay, so they have got to put it in writing, and you want to get it in writing before the grievance meeting is held, okay? There's not a great deal of point in having a grievance meeting without having their grievance letter, okay? So if they're not capable of putting it to writing for whatever reason, then do arrange for assistance for them with this. Okay, now receiving it in writing is really helpful to the process, okay, not only because it will give you clarity to what it is that the employee is concerned about, Okay. If someone just tells you something verbally, you might forget, again, things might get lost in translation. They might raise something with you verbally, go home and think about it and think, do you know what, now I've said it out loud, it doesn't really sound like a problem, or I've not really articulated myself properly. And they can take some time putting it in writing to convey what they really mean to say or want to say to you. Okay. And this then actually helps you to ensure that any follow-up investigation that you might and probably will have to do to some extent is targeted correctly. You're not spending hours going off on a tangent because you've interpreted their issue to be one thing when actually, it's another. So it also helps you to then ensure that you are giving an outcome which addresses the precise nature of the issue raised. Okay, so you can almost have their letter in front of you and use that to mirror your response so that you can clearly demonstrate in respect of this point you've raised, this is my outcome. Okay, number 6 then, so we're moving through now. So hear the grievance before investigating with accused parties. Okay, I think it's really important to meet with the employee before investigating for 2 reasons, and some of them mirror those on the previous slide. Okay, but first up, and I mentioned this before, it's all starting to come back round. The employee's got to be given the option to talk about how they want the issue to be resolved. Okay, because again, you might spend a lot of time and effort thinking about this wonderful plan of how you're going to improve life in work for them, and they might think, well, I don't really want any of that, or I only wanted, this small change, and you've gone to the nth degree for them. So you can find out how they want the issue to be resolved and make sure you're working towards that if appropriate. And it also gives them then that opportunity to reflect on the matter, and their response, may alter the way that you approach the situation, okay, in the meeting. So you might sit and listen to them, so you might have read the letter, understand it to be one thing, you then meet with them and they explain it to you, and they might think, oh goodness me, I'm going over this again. But they might clarify things for you that you had interpreted in a completely different way, so it's just really important to make sure that you're discussing it and making sure that your understanding is the same. Now, equally, by them going through those things then, okay, you can make sure that you're getting or asking for any additional details which you might need to help inform and improve the quality of any follow-up investigations you do. Okay, so yes, Joe Blogs, you're saying said X, Y, and Z to you, but how did they say it? Were there any witnesses? Where did it happen? Is there CCTV in that area that I can go and collect? When, where, why, what prompted them? All these important questions that can help you to understand what is supposed to have happened, which will help to improve your questions and your understanding of the situation and each person's involvement. Number 7 then, we're looking a bit more at allowing a companion, okay? So employees are afforded the legal right to be accompanied at a grievance hearing, okay? And that right is to be accompanied by either an appropriate trade union representative or a colleague, okay? Now, even if you followed a textbook grievance procedure and gave a wonderful outcome to that grievance, okay, in theory, if we denied the right to be accompanied, okay, that is a claim in itself. So technically an employee would still be able to bring a claim in an employment tribunal just for failing to allow the statutory right to be accompanied, okay? So it's very important that if that is asked for, that it is allowed. And in fact, it is really just standard practice to allow an employee to be accompanied at one of these meetings, and in fact, to advise them of that right in your grievance invite letter. Number 8 is about the outcome letter. Okay, so we talked before about issuing this without unreasonable delays, and I did want to come back to it a bit more just to add some quality here. Okay, so this outcome letter should set out any decisions that have been made, okay, and what action you intend to take to resolve the grievance. Okay, so we need to explain the decisions that have been made and what we are doing for that person in respect of it, if anything. Now, it's very important, and again, this is something that ACAS advise. I mean, I would do it for all points, but especially the points of grievance that are not upheld, okay? Your reasons why you're not upholding it, or why you're not able to substantiate it, should be carefully explained. And there is an important distinction there between those two things, and sometimes it's worth explaining that to the employee. You know, if you don't find that you're able to uphold something because you don't agree, you know, that's your opinion, and even more the need to carefully explain why you've reached that opinion. But sometimes you're not able to substantiate what they've said, and that might be because there is simply not enough evidence, you know, to uphold it. But nonetheless, reading that outcome is, you know, can be very distressing to the employee. So it's worth explaining, you know, especially if you believe this to be true, you know, that it's not that I don't believe what you're saying or that there isn't truth to what you've said, but I am just not able to find evidence to prove that what you've said is true, and therefore I don't really have grounds to take anything further, you know, especially if we're talking about the misconduct of somebody else. So it's important that we carefully explain why we're not able to uphold any points of grievance. As we highlighted in that poll then, quite often a grievance will just concern somebody else, and if we have, say, had to take disciplinary action against somebody, then that is part of the conclusion of your grievance process, but we have to be careful to protect that person's confidentiality, okay? So this is where we have to come up with clever phrasing, such as, you know, we have taken the appropriate action against the individual or individuals as we deem to be appropriate given the severity of the situation, okay? You would not put that person has been issued with a final written warning and it will be on their file for 12 months. The next time they put a foot wrong, don't you worry, they'll be out the door. You know, we obviously can't say that. The warning that someone is put on is entirely private and for them to know only. Typically, these things get out of the woodwork, you know, because people talk, but it can't have come from us. We've got to be clever in our wording that gives something that is hopefully satisfactory to the person who raised the grievance, but protects the confidentiality of everybody else involved. Number 9, it's just a thought about collective grievances, because sometimes we mention these to people and we've heard the term but forget quite what they are or what they mean. But a collective grievance then is one which is submitted by more than one employee at the same time. Okay, so multiple people raising a grievance at the same time. Now, some organisations are actually organised enough or robust enough or large enough, maybe, that actually they've got a collective grievance process, a specific one for this situation. Okay, so if you've got one of these, fab, you know, you're prepared, make sure you follow it if you get one, because there is nothing worse than falling foul of your own procedures. It's just embarrassing, firstly. So yeah, make sure that you're aware of your own procedures and you stick to those where you can or where appropriate. But if you don't have one, that's pretty normal. You know, what I would say as a main piece of advice, which is quite quick as well, especially if there are quite a few of them, I would ask the employees to, amongst themselves, you know, this is not something you have to get involved with in any sort of formal way, but just to elect representatives, maybe one person, maybe two, depending on the size of the group, representatives who are going to attend the grievance meeting, okay, on behalf of the rest, who you are going to address the grievance outcome letter to on behalf of the rest, okay? And thereafter, pretty much the process for handling the grievance should essentially be the same. And lastly then, is a thought to facilitated meetings and mediation, okay? So wherever possible, employers and employees, we've got to try and make sure we work through grievances in the workplace, you know, keep it in-house, don't air our dirty laundry to others as much as possible. Where we do have a grievance that concerns relationship issues, okay, so working relations, then I would strongly advise you to consider the benefit of holding facilitated meetings, okay? So a meeting where the line manager, who the grievance has been raised to, sits with both parties, okay, who have perhaps been prepped a little bit beforehand about being constructive. And together you would constructively try to address the matter, okay, that's caused the breakdown, and agree how we're going to move forwards, okay? So what little things are you both going to do to try and improve the working relationship that exists between you? You don't have to be best friends, but how are you going to promise to be civil to each other and work together going forwards, and get them to vocalize it and say what they're going to do and agree to, okay? And I would have a follow-up meeting just to talk about the progress of that, because it's very easy for, you know, us to let them out the door, and actually there's even more tension, you know, emotions are running really high, even more of a desire to fight or flight, you know, once you've just been in that sort of room, even if you're very good at holding facilitated meetings, you know, leaving with that kind of feeling is very possible. So if they've promised, you know, to say hello to each other in the mornings, you know, civilly, to make sure you're including each other on team meeting emails and not deliberately leaving the other out, you know, make sure they're doing these things, come back to the room a week later and a month later, how is things going? Have things been improving? Because you're almost holding them to account a little bit to be able to say, well, yeah, I held up my part. So that would be a really good tip, I think. Now, sometimes this might not work, you know, or sometimes it's sufficiently serious that it needs to go beyond that. Or sometimes the grievance might not be with one other colleague, it might be the employer that the grievance is against, you know, and we're on the tip of a relationship breakdown that could break and end the contract, okay? Now, in this case, I would consider getting in an independent third party to help resolve the problem Okay, and where it is colleague to colleague, that could be an internal mediator, but otherwise you might want to bring in an external mediator. Okay, and whether we're talking about an internal or an external person, they should be professionally qualified in mediation. Okay, mediation is a professional practice. People take training courses in it. Okay, it's a very structured and rigid process. It can be expensive, but sometimes tribunals expect it, especially if we think, you know, this person is otherwise going to walk out and bring a constructive dismissal claim that we could have avoided by having mediation. Okay, so something to be bearing in mind. Now, I'm just going to do another poll just to test that you've been listening. We've been going through a lot though, so I'll just change the pace with this. And again, it's just going to be, you know, I was going to say for fun, but it's not a very nice topic. But, you know, just to see what you think. And I'm not going to share anyone's individual answers. So I'm posing a scenario. Charlie comes to you and she says that her line manager has been repeatedly putting her down about her work, okay, without giving any constructive feedback, and keeps doing it in front of others. She's calling her names because of it now as well. Now, Charlie hasn't raised it before because she was worried that actually it might draw attention to her performance. However, it's all come to a head because she was recently threatened that she was going to get slapped by her line manager unless she turned the radio off, and she was sworn at aggressively as well. Now, Charlie tells you this, but she says that she doesn't want to take it any further because she's scared, but she wanted to bring it to your attention. Okay, so how would you manage this? She's repeatedly being put down at work without constructive feedback. There's name calling now in relation to it. And she's recently been threatened to be slapped unless she turned the radio off and was sworn at aggressively too. Okay, so I'm just going to give you options on how you might deal with this. And you can select all that you think apply. Okay, so I'm just launching this now. And you should have the three options there. So do you attempt to resolve it informally in the first instance? Do you ask Charlie to put it in writing and raise a formal grievance? Or if you don't get a formal grievance, would you investigate it anyway? Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few moments to think about what you would do here. And as I say, you can select all that you think are applicable. Okay, I'll just give you 5 more seconds. We've got most people voted. If you want to have a go. All right, lovely. So I'm just going to look to close that off now. I think we've got most people in. And share the results with you. So let's have a look. What have we got? So we've got about a quarter of you suggesting we attempt to resolve it informally in the first instance. We've got 71%, so a really good proportion of us there. Most of us saying we would ask them to put it in writing and raise a formal grievance. And then the majority are saying if no formal grievance is raised, we would investigate it anyway. Okay, great. So I'm just going to hide those. I should see the main webinar again now, hopefully. I'll put the answer up. So I would suggest that we go with B and C. Okay, now I have been plugging that you always try and address agreements informally in the first instance. I do appreciate that. In this case, we have got somebody saying or strongly alluding to the fact that they might be being bullied, okay, over a period of time as well, okay. So in this case, we would look to advise Charlie that this is a serious matter and that serious grievances need to be put in writing and dealt with in a formal manner in the first instance, okay. Now, she was saying that she didn't want you to deal with it, you know, and didn't want you to take it any further. So you might say, well, look, what about informally? But you're better meeting your duty of care by saying, please put it in writing. I want to address this through a formal procedure. And actually, even if you decide that you don't want to put it in writing, absolutely, and pretty much all of us got this, which is fantastic, you know, we are going to investigate this anyway, because we cannot allow bullying or allegations of bullying, at least, to go unaddressed. Okay, so we need to know if bullying is going on. If it's not, great, perhaps then we need to have a word with Charlie. But if it is, we need to put a stop to it. Okay, so that's great. So I know we're running a little over, so if you can continue to join us, that's fantastic. But we've just got our last short section now before our summary. So a bit of a watch out. So things to watch out for that can crop up with grievances. Okay. Firstly, disciplinary hearings. All right. So think carefully about how to handle a grievance that might suddenly be launched upon you during a disciplinary process or during a disciplinary hearing. Okay. In some cases, it may be that the disciplinary process should be temporarily suspended in order to address that grievance before the hearing continues. Okay, so we would really need to consider the nature of the grievance and whether or not that is something we can manage at the same time as the hearing, or whether or not it should take precedence, stop the hearing, deal with the grievance before then resuming with the disciplinary process. So if you aren't sure, please do seek advice on the circumstances. Next up is resignations. Okay, so if you get a resignation and it raises issues at work, okay, then it heavily insinuates that they are leaving because of those issues, okay? Now, if they are saying that they're leaving because of something that an employer ought to have protected them from, okay, or is really fundamental to their terms of employment that's been breached in some way, okay, and they are effectively then saying, I've had no choice but to resign, we really need to ask them to reconsider their resignation, because potentially this could be signposting a constructive dismissal claim. Okay. Now, whether or not you think there's grounds to the claim, it's good practice. Okay, if someone raises issues in a resignation, that we ask them to reconsider their resignation, and we either offer, or if we're worried about it, we instigate a grievance process for them, okay, or an investigation into the matters if they're really saying, no, I'm not taking part in a grievance, okay. Sometimes you do get resignations in the heat of the moment, and employers have fallen foul of accepting heat of the moment resignations, so we need to be careful. Building in a cooling off period is a great way of doing that. You know, the purpose of this really is to try and maintain the employment of that employee, because hopefully they're someone we want to keep. You know, they've got to resignation, we've not pushed them out, hopefully. So hopefully we can resolve the matter. But as I say, in some cases, actually having that grievance or even offering that grievance allows us to assess and minimise the risk of a constructive dismissal claim. And that might sound a bit of a cold approach, but you know, this is the point at which it's HR's job to protect the organisation, you know, from these types of issues. So we can determine what the risk is, try and put it right. But you know, if they leave anyway, it makes it much more difficult for an employee to claim they've been constructively dismissed if they were offered a grievance and the employee genuinely tried to attempt to resolve it once they were aware of it, because they haven't done all that they could to try and mitigate their loss of employment. So watch out for resignations, raising a grievance. And lastly, a thought about line managers and their teams, okay, and whether or not they can raise grievances against one of their team members. Okay, what do you think? Okay, well, no, okay, line managers should not normally raise grievances against the employees they line manage, okay? And if you think about it, it stands to reason, because they're actually already in a position to manage the behaviour that they're aggrieved about, you know. So if it's because of their performance, the line manager should be managing them through capability processes. And if it's because of their conduct, then the line manager should be managing through your disciplinary processes, okay? So if a line manager comes to you and says, look, my employees that I'm supposed to look after are driving me crazy, you know, driving me up the wall, I'm not happy with them, it's just I'm really struggling here, then actually this may point to a need to support them with being a line manager, or even helping to develop their line management skills. You know, quite often people get promoted to managerial positions because they're good at their skill or their trade, and sometimes actually being a people manager and development in that area is left to the wayside. So if someone's saying these sorts of things, they might just need support with this avenue, with employee relations. Okay. So in summary, if I can leave you with key takeaways from this session, I would say to you to have a grievance policy that's accessible to all employees so that you manage their expectations from the start and just manage to try and inbuild a chance of some consistency across the organisation in how they're handled. I would try to attempt to resolve most grievances informally in the first instance. I would go to a formal route if the issue is serious or if the informal approach didn't give the employee a satisfactory resolution. I'd follow that ACAScode of practice. Make sure you follow your internal policy and procedures, because again, you know, breach of contract claim. Well, so yes, if your policies are contractual, you know, that can risk a breach of contract claim if you don't follow them. So don't fall foul of not following your own rules. You know, keep your ear to the ground, and despite following the code of practice and your policy, do consider what's fair in the circumstances, because each situation is unique and might warrant a bit of tweaking here and there. Avoid unreasonable delays and explain the reasons for any points of grievance which are not upheld in the outcome letter very clearly to the employee. And that brings us to the end of our webinar today. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you got something from it. Thank you for the questions that have been submitted already. If you do have any other questions, please do pop them over to us now. You also get a follow-up email after this webinar as well to thank you for joining. So that's another opportunity if you think of anything you'd like to ask to get in touch with me. But you can contact us in these ways on screen, and clients can contact us in the usual way. Please do take a moment to download that handout, so the ACAScode of practice there as well. For those of you who aren't knowledge-based subscribers, just to let you know that we have a portal at HR Solutions, which includes all kinds of articles, template documents, template policies that can help guide you through grievance processes, but also any other type of employee relations, HR, or employment law issue. So please do let us know if you'd like to have a demo of that. And lastly, we have some upcoming webinars. So if you're interested in any of these topics, please do save your spot on them. So next month we're doing sexual harassment, which, you know, sometimes issues come up as grievances like this, but it might require us sometimes to go about it in a slightly different way, you know. So handling a complaint is something we're going to look at next month. We're rounding off the year by looking at interesting cases. So some tribunal wins and losses that employers have had that might reassure you or might make you think twice about how you approach something. We've also got some cases in there where employees have had awards made against them. So that's quite intriguing. And we've got 2020. We're starting to plan that in. So there's some big changes coming up in 2020 that every employer has to know about. So please do join us for that and get ahead of the game in January. So that just leaves me then to say thank you once again. As I say, I do hope you've got something out of it. We're really pleased that you could join us, and we do hope that you'll join us again for another webinar another time. But enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care and goodbye. Thank you.